So, right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you and welcome to our talk today. It is just, wow. I'm here, I feel like I'm here with Dr. Dina Isom, and she is the associate professor in criminal justice, but she's also in African American Studies. We started together, so I think this is why it really means a lot to me. But Dr. Dina Isom, she earned her doctorate from Emory University in 2015. Her research and teaching interests include criminological theory, critical perspective, social psychology, social inequality and stratification, race and gender, law and justice, and methods and statistics. I'm tired. Dr. Isom's work has been published in, and I mean, she has really been doing some great publications in criminal justice and behavior, feminist criminology, social science and medicine, and critical sociology. Her book, Whiteness and Crime Status, Entitlement and Privilege, is forthcoming from Routledge. Yay! In 2020, Dr. Isom won a Garnet Apple Award for excellence in teaching from University of South Carolina. So the next voice that you're going to hear will be Dr. Dina Isom. I hope you enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tolson, for that kind introduction. I appreciate it. Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Dina Isom, and I just appreciate you all being here and showing a little bit of interest in some of the work that I've been doing. I'm going to share my screen. Let me back up. Nancy, can I get a go? That's all good? Or Jillian? Is it showing?
It's good? All good.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you. So the title of my talk today is called Entitlement, Anger, and Crime, an Examination of White America. And it really is kind of an overview of the work I've been doing, particularly in the last 4 years, and the current projects that I'm working on, particularly my book. And so giving you a little bit of a background about what I do in general. As Dr. Tolson said, I am jointly appointed in African American Studies and the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice. And so I have broadly always kind of focused on understanding racial and ethnic and gender disparities in offending and contact with the system, particularly from an intersectional perspective, and really focusing on certain types of aspects that are distinct to people of color and those in marginalized and oppressed positions. And so thinking about experience of discrimination across different groups, and coming from a social psych background, really thinking about the emotions that arise from those experiences, and then how those emotions may lead to more deviant and negative behaviors that could get people entangled in the system if they don't have legitimate ways to cope with them and help them deal with those experiences. And so thinking about also how gender socialization, racial socialization, identity help protect people from the discrimination and marginalization that they may experience. I've also looked at more institutional and social structural type elements, looking at the impacts of discriminatory practices embedded in institutions, particularly those that impact people of color and women. And so those have kind of been my big, broad themes. But in the midst of doing all of this research and hoping to bring marginalized experiences to the forefront and countering stereotypical beliefs about their experiences and behaviors, we also know that there's been a rise in racial tensions again. So there was a vast increase in the number of hate groups, particularly around neo-Nazis, the KKK and whatnot, in response to the election of President Obama. Then that led to the election of President Trump. And in the midst of all of these things, we're having numerous people of color being killed by the police, and we're seeing these rise in racial tensions, and we have the Charlottesville riots, and all kind of culminating recently with January 6th. And we see from a lot of polling information over the last several years that a lot of people at least believe that racial tensions are worse than they've been in decades. And so while I've been focusing on and always driven by this idea to center and investigate lived experience of the marginalized and the oppressed, and particularly bringing voices of people of color center in our understanding of these things in criminology, which has always kind of been discriminatory in its own right towards people of color. Embedded in the work that I ground my research on, such as Black feminist thought and critical race theory, is kind of this call to bring whiteness forefront. And so Hilary Potter, who's one of the scholars that I greatly admire, even said in her 2015 book, researchers typically include the demographics of their research samples in their publications, yet often the race of white is deemed the default and regularly goes unexamined, as though white is not a race. Certainly white is a race. Consequently, criminologists should at least contemplate how being white may influence individuals' experiences compared to those other races. And so it really does bring forth this idea that far too often, and I mean, it's pretty much constant, that we assume white people as the norm, as the given, as the default, that then we compare other people to. And we never step back and question, well, what about them? Why is that the normative? What may be wrong with that thinking? How do their lived experiences counter those of people of color, and how may that impact our understanding of disparities? And then also going back even further, putting it into the context of the history of our country and really questioning the normative of whiteness in general and white supremacist ideologies that are embedded in all of our institutions and our laws that have perpetuated and created this social stratification and these disparities that we have even up until today. And so that really inspired me to start thinking about and flipping on its head the work that I was already doing, but really critiquing this whiteness and really challenging the normative of a white lens. And here's some of the publications I already have to date, and I'll talk about a few of them in the coming times. But there is some literature already out there on whiteness. It's just not really in the crim literature, as Potter very much brought out. So it has been prominent in some realms of sociology, in political science in particular, talking about voter preferences and whatnot. And we also see it often in just general surveys of society, because when everybody is asked about discrimination, that includes white people, though we know that that is problematic in some ways. And so because a lot of my research on people of color had focused on experiences and perceptions of discrimination and the impact of that, and we know that those questions are asked of white people, even though they may not always be relevant, and there's this narrative in the literature around what does that mean for white people. That was kind of my starting point a few years ago. And looking at the literature broadly, we find that Pew Research Center, Public Religion Research Institute, two large national polling places, have found consistently about a third of white Americans claim that they experience racial discrimination. And it's not just, in these studies, I found it consistently in my work as well. There's also been longitudinal studies that have shown that people of color, particularly Black people's perceptions of the degree of discrimination in society has remained pretty stable over time, but white people's have increased, saying that they now are discriminated at higher levels than people of color. And so it really leads to this question is like, what do they think that they're experiencing? Because we know that in all honesty, their position in society means that they can't truly be discriminated against based on their race, but they are perceiving that there's some type of anti-white bias. And these perceptions can still have an impact on their behaviors, on their perceptions, on their interactions with others, and so forth. And so why is this so prevalent in white America? Who are these people that are feeling this way? And what are the impacts of this? Were kind of my beginning questions when I began to think through this whiteness literature. And it's really amazing that these people feel this way. The references here are a bit dated because things have changed over the course of the pandemic. But these feelings of being discriminated against by white people are really coming at a time when society has never really been more equal. We have more Black college enrollment is steadily increased. The gender gap in wages is decreasing. We have more women leading Fortune 500 companies. We see that same-sex marriage is finally protected by the Constitution. You know, the 116th Congress coming out of the 2018 election was the most diverse in history. So we are far from actually reaching equality, but we're making strides. But we say it's still white people, and particularly white men, remain on top. Like white students still have the highest graduation rates. White men still earn more than anybody else, and they still hold the most positions of power. And so how can we explain this disconnect between reality and perceptions? And the thing is that many white people tend to feel like they are losing as they see people of color, as they see women, as they see these other people that are not them gaining in society. Then they think that they must somehow be losing places. They see it as a zero-sum game. And this is happening too when we've also seen things happening in larger society, that there's been a large loss of jobs. This was even pre-pandemic in terms of manufacturing and really earning a living wage in some type of industrial job, agriculture and whatnot. Real wages, we know, have not grown since the 1980s. And so people aren't keeping up with inflation. And now we see this even recent rise as well. And expenses are increasing. And so there's this talk that around this more conservative narrative, particularly driven by the voices on talk radio and the news media and whatnot, that the middle class no longer really exists, particularly the white middle class. And they're now really more of a working poor, that it just takes one bad thing to happen and they would be in a bad position. And so they start looking for someone to blame for this. And they tend to blame people that are not like them. And so Michael Kimmel really talked about this in his book in 2017, and others have alluded to these things as well, particularly Hammond. And I think putting these two quotes together really kind of bring forth this sentiment that if one believes the story that whites losing the presidency, losing cultural icons, losing college admission opportunities, and losing jobs, then they feel they have lost more than they've actually lost because of the immense power and resources whites had to begin with. Therefore, efforts to level the playing field may feel like water is rushing uphill, like it's reverse discrimination against whites. Meritocracy sucks when you're suddenly one of the losers and not the winners. And so that's really it. There's more people in the game now, and their perceptions of the game have really shifted. And so they're feeling this threat of others, even though things have not necessarily changed for them. Giving other people an opportunity does not take away their own, but they don't perceive it that way. And so what really drives these feelings? So as I said, there has been a good bit of work in this, particularly around the election of Trump, thinking about why are people feeling this way, coming out of sociology, and a lot of really good qualitative work. And we find that, these people that feel this way, these white people, tend to be the most downwardly mobile, though we also find it amongst the highly educated. And we've come to find it's actually kind of a U shape. So those more at the lowest end of socioeconomic status and the highest end of socioeconomic status support these kind of beliefs. Men more than women, though we do see these things are highly gendered, and there are women that definitely have these types of perceptions, but we see that they tend to be there for other types of reasons than men. Those that already have internalized prejudicial racial attitudes have more conservative ideologies and support this idea of American individualism and have internalized the idea of the American dream, and particularly support the idea of the status quo. And so if you work hard, if you've done what you're supposed to do, then you're gonna be successful. And you've got to remember, particularly these men, these white families are coming from generation after generation. Kids have done better than their parents. And we're seeing that that has finally changed. And so they're feeling like this real disconnect, and what Michael Kimmel calls aggrieved entitlement, because they're like, I did what I was supposed to do. I went to school and, got my degree. I'm supposed to go work at the factory, or I'm supposed to be able to get this type of job. I should be able to support my family in this type of way because I've done what I was told I was supposed to do. And there's been things that have changed in society that have made that harder. But when those things don't pan out, they then say they feel this loss because they had this sense of entitlement that is how things are supposed to work. And so when they don't, they blame others. They look for somebody to blame beyond themselves, and not looking at broader social structures and the people in power and policies that may have led to this. They see it more as, well, what do they see changing in their hometown? What do they see changing, in their workplace? What do they see changing in their children's schools? And so they're seeing immigrants, they're seeing people of color, they're seeing more women, then they're seeing this also play out on mainstream media. And so then they start blaming and saying they're taking my spot, and not thinking about that, no, it wasn't your spot to begin with. And you still had the same opportunities and options as you did before. There's these other structural factors that are making it harder for everyone. But these feelings lead to broad negative emotions, particularly anger, that then still amplify all of these feelings. And so it leads to this othering, this us versus them. They start internalizing ideas that come out of white supremacy, such as racism and sexism and nativism, and wanting to push back against these supposed changes and want to hold on to their position and life that they were supposed to have, is what tends to play out in these qualitative narratives. Now we know Ezra Klein has actually done a really amazing job investigating this stuff recently, particularly over the Trump era leading into the pandemic, about we've also become much more polarized. People used to live in more isolated communities. It took more for people to connect across spaces, but now with the internet and more choices on television and whatnot, then you can go seek out the type of information and knowledge and norms that you want. And so people are hearing more of these extremist ideas that reinforce these narratives that you're losing, that they're taking things from you, and whatnot. And so when they're hearing it over and over again, then it gets reinforced, it gets internalized, those feelings get stronger, and we become more and more polarized. And it's harder to talk across the bridge. But then it's also more and more people, particularly white people, start to feel this way, and feel ways that used to only we would associate with extremist groups. And those feelings are becoming much more commonplace. So kind of in the midst of dealing with all of this literature, thinking about how does this come together? What does this mean for potential offending behaviors? I leaned back on my sociology roots and came up with this concept a few years ago. This paper came out in 2018 that I call status dissonance, and developed a theory that I entitled status dissonance theory, kind of around this concept. And so it builds on the theory out of social psychology called status characteristics theory, which, long story short, it essentially just talks about how things like race and gender come to have more value than others. So why do we think that white men, have more power and position than other people? And so it builds on that kind of basic idea. And so status dissonance, I really define as the degree of discrepancy between where one believes those with similar characteristics, so race, gender, class, sexuality, religion, whatnot, should be positioned in society, and then where one believes others actually position people similar to themselves. And so in more common terms, it's this disconnect, thinking, you've internalized these norms. So I think that because I am a white male, I should be in a position of power, but I'm not in reality type. So that's where the dissonance comes from. And so what I generally argue is that, this idea that status dissonance posits that this overall status value, so how those things come together, so you're man, you're white, you're middle class, whatnot, how they come together to define you, will actually influence the degree that you internalize normative beliefs, or otherwise known as referential structures. So those ideas that men are better than women, white people should have more power, those normative, stereotypical beliefs about who has more value and position than others. And that then this internalization of those normative beliefs will then influence your perceptions of justice. And so things being fair, things being distributed fairly in terms of resources and power and prestige. And that this leads to those feelings of status dissonance. And then that will lead to a positional lens through which you see the world. And so it construes your perceptions of interactions and outcomes, and impacts your beliefs about your position in the world. And those referential structures can be conditioned by contact with dissimilar others. So like, I know that these are the norms, I kind of believe them, but the more contact you have with people of color, if you're a white person, or immigrants or whatnot, then you get to know them as individuals, then that can impact and change your beliefs about those normative ideas. And then it's also conditioned by these broadcast processes. So again, that information that's taken in from the outside, whether it be media, contact with peers that reinforce those ideas and whatnot. So all of that conditions those ideas of referential structures. So again, like who you are made up changes your feelings and perceptions of, where you should be in society. That impacts how you view and interact with the world. I got funding from the university a few years ago, collected a nationally representative survey, and found some general support for this. Also using secondary data from Pew, it's pretty much playing out as would suggest. And so that was kind of where I was thinking. And so what do I know so far? Like, what have I found so far in the research that I've done? And really, what does this mean for criminology? Because we haven't even talked about crime yet. I came across this data set that was collected by some psychologists back in 2017 that were really focused on trying to profile the alt-right. And so doing some secondary analysis of their work, I kind of started looking at more of these extremist beliefs. And I've had 3 papers come out using that data set with various graduate students and colleagues. And the first thing was we pulled from the old kind of hate crime literature and really found what Bear had referred to in the past as this victim ideology that was very prominent in these more extremist beliefs. And that is really kind of framed as these ideas that whites face racial discrimination, that whites' rights, particularly to their own culture, are being denied, rights are stigmatized for expressing racial pride, discrimination, loss of rights, and stigma lead to a loss of self-esteem and psychological distress, and that these attacks are a threat to the existence of the white race. And so kind of this culmination of these ideas that we talked about, feeling these threats from these ideas from the outside, this threat to the status quo, whatnot, then they see themselves as victims. So using the data on the alt-right, we really do find that the higher people feel this victim ideology, the more likely they are to openly associate with the alt-right. And we know that internalization of gender normative beliefs, so these ideas that men should be the heads of the household, the breadwinners, whatnot, women shouldn't necessarily hold positions of power, amplify these associations and make them stronger. And they operate very differently between men and women. We also see that building off these victim ideologies, that perceptions of status threat. So we gauge those by questions such as, if Black Americans were on top, they would want the group currently dominating to suffer, or whites should lobby to appeal rights that give minorities an advantage on the basis of their race at the expense of whites. And so the degree that people agree with such statements were used as a measure of this feeling of status threat. So the people were coming after their positions on top of society. And that led to an increased likelihood of being affiliated with the alt-right. There was also open-ended questions in this survey. And so we did a qualitative assessment of what these people that self-identified as alt-right were really discussing and how they were feeling. And 3 major themes kind of emerged from that analysis: this idea of threats to us, return to the good old days, and ideas of faux news. And so this threat to us really includes discourse about which respondents express that resources for their livelihood are under threat from outside consumption, and that they're not represented by mainstream media, and particularly mainstream Republicans. This return to good old days broadly reflects a desire for respondents to make America great again. So preservation, restoration, and protection of the white race. And then the faux news is really tied to this kind of 2 counter ideas that the alt-right perceives in mainstream media and technology to play into social problems and misconceptions. And so they don't trust mainstream outlets. And so they go to these more extremist, hidden, covert outlets. And so trusting sites that they see on the internet and whatnot instead of mainstream news. And then I've also done some work around the general white population, and so not just focusing on these more extremist beliefs, but how frequently do these things, occur in general population overall for white Americans. And again, we see that white men, those self-identified as lower class, ones with the least education, are most likely to say that we've already achieved racial equality, and that people that have been historically oppressed and marginalized don't need anything else, that we need to repeal laws and policies that help try to level the playing field. And they're also more likely to perceive anti-white bias or say that they've been discriminated against personally, as well as think that it's an overall problem in society. So general ideas of status threat. We also find that concern over this discrimination towards white people and a lack of concern about discrimination towards Black people, as well as concern over illegal immigration. I'm sure that these things like resonate with things that you've heard in general media and whatnot, along with this trust in this more conservative and extremist media, increases these feelings of status threat. And this is among general Americans. So we're finding this across nationally representative surveys, as well as convenient samples, and primary sources and secondary sources. Again, these ideas of victim ideology, we also found were tied to support for Trump, as well as having anti-Black Lives Matter sentiments. And again, internalizing more patriarchal gender norms amplified these associations, and they varied across how they operated between men and women. And getting closer more to the models of crime, I also find that these feelings of aggrieved entitlement, again, leaning back on Kimmel's work and this sense of blame towards marginalized groups, and increased negative emotions that resulted from these things, increase these perceptions of anti-white bias. And now getting closer and importantly to the ideas of crime, is that we find that these perceptions of anti-white bias lead to high degrees of anger and a high degree of likelihood of engaging in criminal behavior, especially for young white men. And this is the key. These associations are stronger for white people, particularly white men, than they are for Black and Latinx youth. I had a sample that had all three that we can do comparisons of, and that is extremely telling. And so with these types of things all playing together, I've come up with this new theory of whiteness and crime that I'm currently working on as I finish, that's going to be the core of my book. Is this idea that status dissonance leads to these feelings of status threat and aggrieved entitlement, which reinforce each other. And that these ideas and feelings can lead to a high degree and likelihood of engaging in criminal and deviant behavior. And then this is really the new kicker that brings in thinking about the larger implications of this even beyond individuals, that even though they engage in this behavior, white privilege then protects against people getting entangled in the system. Because we do know from all types of crime data that from self-report data, people actually telling you what they do, the vast majority of us, over 90%, engage in some type of behavior that could technically land you in jail all the time. So, but we look at arrest statistics that come from official sources, which are really more of a measure of police behavior and thinking about what the system does, that we see this disparities, that people of color, particularly Black men, are grossly overrepresented in those stats. And there's various reasons about why these things happen and the disconnect between those statistics. But one of the biggest ones is this idea of white privilege. So people might engage in the behavior, but there's things that make it less likely that they're going to come to the attention of the police. If they do come to the attention of the police, they may not get charged. They may get left off. If they do get charged, they're more likely to be able to have access to a lawyer. We know that things are going to be treated differently in terms of what the prosecutors decide to do, how judges act, how juries respond. We can show these things that impact these things throughout all of the system and the process that leads it to people actually being incarcerated. And those are implications of white privilege, that white people have more access, that white people are given more of a shot of a doubt, that are giving more opportunities than people of color and those in other marginalized positions. And so that is what I'm currently working on. I've also received funding from the provost office to collect data to be able to test this model, which I'm doing this summer. I've been waiting through COVID to collect the data to try to not let that be so much of a factor. But that's where I am currently. And so general takeaways from this so far, that there is a divide that's broader and deeper than most really want to admit in this country. And there is extensive fear and loathing among white Americans, particularly those at the poles of advantage and disadvantage and more conservative core beliefs. And the consumption of and trust in polarized media reinforces these divides, that over a third of white Americans feel unjustly treated about their race and hold these more extremist beliefs that we don't necessarily want to acknowledge it. And these feelings cross all demographic lines. It's not just men. And it's not just those that are in the lower class. It crosses all of white America. And these perceptions are often highly gendered and associated with other normative belief systems. And these are linked to negative and disruptive behaviors. And so this is why these things matter. And so I and my colleague Tia Anderson said in our paper that tied it all to crime, that while white people's privileged position in American society disallows their true oppression, like we know this, that white people really can't be oppressed. They may still feel discriminated against. And perceptions and feelings have consequences, and they matter. And understanding these things is a way to begin to tackle them and counter them and actually push us towards a more equitable society, and particularly in terms of breaking norms of whiteness and white supremacy within our institutions. And so that is all I've got.
That was wonderful and so insightful. I don't know if anyone has questions, please. The question box is open, but I have a couple of comments on, we talked a lot about white men and privilege, and we did not discuss white women, the issues with white women, and all of that.
Yeah, so it's in a lot of my lit. I didn't do it here, but I'll talk about it now. So the interesting thing about white women, and Kimmel alludes to it, and then I find it in my stuff as well. The white women won't, like, they've internalized the norms of the gender hierarchy, and so they don't want women in positions of power. They would rather be seen as mothers and wives, and they want their men to be successful, and they don't want to have to work. And so they're resentful for the fact that we've pretty much become a society that we have to have a 2-income household. Those old school ideas of the man goes to work and the woman stays home pretty much can't happen anymore. And so a lot of times they will believe in these things, even though they don't necessarily serve them, because that does serve their ideas of wanting to be a mom and a stay-at-home wife and those types of things.
But that fascinates me for the mere fact that a lot of family households do not have there's not a 2-family household, a 2-parent household, and that there's a lot of single Black mothers and a lot of single white women who are out there raising children. So this falsehood is really, I think it's, I keep thinking back when you said about, we're looking at the, networks, television, and how we've had these, the mother and the father and the 2 kids, or the 2.5 kids, will always scare me, because that half kid I don't want to see. But, it's the whole idea and concept that this is a falsehood right here. So when we talk about make America great again, they're low. What are they really?
Again, it never was.
It never was.
That's the thing. It never was. And so it's like countering all of these false narratives, that are embedded in those ideas. Yeah. Yeah, it's really, really hard because we also see a lot of the political science literature obviously links to the voting ideas. So many of these people will vote for things that are actually counter that for them because of these rooted ideas, like based in the American dream and really like stereotypical Christian core moral beliefs, even though a lot of that, because is counter to what Jesus would really argue. But yeah, they'll vote against and do things that are counter to what would actually serve them based on these ideologies.
Wow. We have a question. Based on your research, how do you think this information will affect the court's decision on affirmative action?
I mean,
wow.
Yeah. It shouldn't be challenged right now, but the problem is with most of these court decisions, like they don't look at empirical research, and so too many times there is a big disconnect between all these laws and policies and these decisions and what we can show in social science. And so, I mean, affirmative action still needs to be in place. So hopefully they'll uphold it, because like we've said, we know that we haven't reached an equitable society yet. We're far from it, and actually the past 2 years with the pandemic has pushed us back in so many ways. And so hopefully those things won't be countered, but
yeah. And when you were talking about male white middle class, the ones who are out here that are doing the protest are not middle class. And I'm wondering, when they say that they're taking their jobs, whoever they are who are taking their jobs, people of color, a lot of these people aren't qualified for the jobs.
Right. Well, and it's also like there's a change in the industry. Like you push back and think about like the narratives around coal in the 2016. Like we know that we need to move away from those types of things. And so those communities that are still based in those types of industries, those industries have to evolve. And then you have to help those people be able to fill those jobs. You can't just hold on to these things that we know that are dying,
Exactly.
And so it's changing those types of narratives and thinking and giving people the opportunities to develop the skills to be able to do the jobs that are needed.
That's a scary thought. They really believe in taking my spot. And what spot is there?
Yeah, it's not your spot to begin with. I remember it was Kimmel refers to this. I don't remember, one of the talk shows back in the 90s, but even the title of the show was "They Took My Job." It's like, why is it mine? Like, it's not yours.
It's not yours.
A job. Yeah. Right. But it's also, we also got to think about, especially when they push against immigrants, is this idea, like, question the industries, question the systems. Let's think about minimum wage and this idea that we all need to be able to make a living wage, and we don't send industry overseas. Like, how can we do things to lift up the floor for everybody, to have a better life and opportunity and a living wage than trying to infighting. But the infighting has always been created by those in positions of power, going back to history, like through history. We think about, because we had slaves from Africa and we had indentured servants. Right. And even the creation of the idea of whiteness is rooted in trying to make those groups not get along. Right, exactly. And so that's really the root of it in this country. And so it's really fed by this capitalist system that was led to all of it, that's all embedded in this white supremacist idea. As Bell Hooks likes to call it, the white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. Like, yes, because it is. It's all the things.
That's right. That's right. Your colleague, Dr. Lee, he said, "Hi, Dina. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. I have a piggyback question to Nancy's question. I had thought that historically, since the end of Jim Crow," give me that date. Anyway, it is the white professional managerial class that has been the most segregated, occupationally and residentially, more so than the white working class. Can you talk about the sociological differences between the self-identified lower class whites and middle to elite whites in terms of their interracial exposure? That's really good.
Yeah, that is really good. Oh, Solgi, always pushing me. I think it is more of, and you can see it in the literature, about these ideas to be able to self-segregate versus not. And those in the middle class still very much have this, where they like consciously or unconsciously realizing they're doing it, have more of a choice to still be able to self-segregate. You know, like we can move to a different neighborhood. We can choose to go to this, you know, send our kids to this type of school or, you know, whatnot, where those in the lower class may not have the means and options to. So as things are shifting around them, maybe their neighborhoods are getting, you know, more influx of people of color or immigrants, or the shift in changing in the school system, the changing in the industry. They don't have the means to be able to flee it, and so then they, you know, feel even more resentful. White flight's a real thing. We know it, and that perpetuates segregation. But and that plays into the white privilege, and so those people have more means to be able to do that, and then those in the lower class don't, but they think they should, and so then they feel that resentment and that aggrieved entitlement. That
they say the most segregated time of the week is when? During church. Sunday, right. Okay, you know, but you also think many people would not have mixed and mingled if they had not been employed at big companies or even small companies. They would not have known anyone else besides their own.
Right, which is why I think that contact with dissimilar others is so important, because it is one of those, you get to know people. You have to choose, like, and sometimes in those conditions, like at work, you're forced to, or you make conscious decisions to make friends and integrate and like live your life amongst people that are different than yourself, and that can impact, you know, those changes in those beliefs. Because whether we believe it or not, those normative ideas are embedded in everything. Like thankfully we see the messages in children's media and literature, and you can speak to all these things, you know, changing. What we see on television and in movies is changing, but it still hasn't fully changed. And so we still get this idea of, you know, who is most deserving, who is most beautiful, who should be in positions of power, that's been perpetuated throughout all of our history. So,
you know, one of the things that has really been bothering me, and we see it more and more, is the news coverage of a Black man who's been in prison for 30 years. And he's been in prison because some white woman has lied on him. Evidence was hidden. Oops, the doctors forgot to put this out to, you know, to make him, you know, to actually prove his innocence. All of these things, they've been coming out more and more and more. And then some places, I can't remember one incident where the man, they've proven him innocent, but they still haven't let him out of prison yet. You know, these conditions are just ridiculous.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, those types of things are the things I cover in my miscarriages of justice class. But the thing, like, thankfully, people like Brian Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative, and even here locally, Justice 360, are taking those cases forward and bringing them to light. But we know so many, particularly men of color, were wrongfully convicted on no evidence. If you know the word of a white woman or a white man, usually by an all white jewelry, like it's and it's hard to get those things overturned, even when it is blatantly clear and egregious that is the case, because that's how our court system works.
Yeah,
like,
that's crazy.
Once a conviction happens, they don't want to admit that it was wrong.
They were wrong.
Yeah. And so it's really, really hard to ever get those things changed.
Yeah. And we're finding more students who are going into criminal justice, going into law school. And, you know, at one point you're going, oh, another lawyer. And now I say, no, we need more, because they need to be pouring in to do the research, to, you know, stop this, because it has become so that one day we're going to become very numb. Oh, another one. Oh, he got out after 20 years or 30 years, you know.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I wonder if we've already kind of reached those points, you know, that it is so, it's just, it's taken for granted that this is how our system works. And so,
Seriously.
yeah, it is very important that our students, you know, get involved and find ways to fight against the system, whether it be as being as lawyers and actually practicing, or working in nonprofits and pushing policy, or, you know, or whatnot. There's ways that we can all fight back. And one of the easiest ways is with our vote. And, you know, we also got to fight back against voter suppression, which is one of the things I'm going to ask Ben Crump about next week. So that's my shameless plug. Come next Thursday.
we have it. It says, join us next week on Thursday, March 24th at 7 for Seeking Accountability in Pursuit of Justice, a conversation with Ben Crump, hosted by Dr. Dina Isom. So I'm very excited about that. So that is already in our chat. So you can make yourselves, please come, you're invited. And someone had their hand up, but I don't know how to identify a hand raised. If you can put it in the chat. Oh, here's one. Over than through the courts or legislation, what do you see as actions that can be taken to address the issues you've raised? Other than through the courts or legislation, what do you see as actions that can be taken to address the issues you've raised?
Well, I think a lot of it's even rooted, and I teach this type of stuff in my Unpacking Whiteness class, is that white people have got to take responsibility. They've got to learn and recognize these things, and what D'Angelo is called white fragility. Don't get all upset and saying people are calling you personally a racist.
Right.
Like, no, that's not what it is. This is. It's recognizing the ideology that is embedded in all of this, that we've all been internalized to, the privileges that we get because we were once born with paler skin, you know, that, and to live in this society, and just to recognize that, understand the history, and then use that to fight back and change your thinking about these things. And so then that could, okay. I don't know what that, that can change your thinking about who you choose to interact with, the institutions you choose to support, the businesses you choose to support, how you impact your vote. All of those things matter. And so just moving through the world with more conscious effort as a white person, and being willing, and so many of us too, even those that know these things and care, will still keep their mouth shut when friends, family say something derogatory, do something derogatory. And it's one of those, be willing to challenge those relationships and challenge those norms.
Right.
Go
ahead.
No, sorry.
Yeah. No, I was at a lecture last year when, and I can't remember his name, when the lecturer stated, he said, those who do nothing about it fall into and allow white supremacy to still carry them through. Right. So they will say they're not a racist, but they still abide by the laws of white supremacy instead of breaking them.
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah.
Because we all benefit from it, whether we acknowledge it or not. And so that's one, so I actually have a shirt that says white silence. I'm failing. White silence is complicit. I don't remember exactly. I'm getting it confused with one of my friends. Hers says white silence is violence. Black Lives Matter. But yeah, no, mine says white silence is consent. That's it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And that's true. That's true. So, and here we are. You know, we're wondering, so they didn't say anything about it. This happened. Everyone was silent. So they are living on the white supremacy that was laid out, the laws of white supremacy. So we do have to be
complicit to it. Yeah.
Right.
Without, when you don't stand up and say anything and take any type of action, then you're complicit to perpetuate the norms that are.
Exactly. Well, I think if we have no more questions, and we don't, I really want to, I'm making sure, and the Ben Crump event will be in person only.
It is in person.
Yes, please, please come, please come. We're doing it. People are thanking you for this great presentation. They said they really enjoy it. It was a wonderful presentation, so much information, and it was very smooth, and I love it when it's smooth. So you are wonderful, Dr. Dina Isom, and I thank you for this hour that you've given us. So well, thank you.
I appreciate it. Thank you all for coming.
And thank everyone for coming. We really appreciate it. Okay. Everyone take care. Bye-bye.